Hello and welcome to How to Be a Better DM, a part of Session Zero Studios. My name is Tanner Wayland, and I'm going to help you today learn how to have a great time playing and directing D&D, whether you're a current or future DM. Now, today's topic, it's a very important one. Can a combat encounter be too long or too short? Simply put, yes. And that's what we're going to be discussing today. Basically, I'm going to talk about how it can be a real drag on your story, on the campaign, on the player's enjoyment if a combat is so short that it feels meaningless or so long that you just lose the players, right? And I'm going to do this through the framework of 3 questions that can help you determine if your combat encounter is just right in terms of length. Kind of like, Goldilocks and the 3 bears. You don't want something too long or too short. You want it just right. And you're going to be able to learn with these 3 questions what just right means. But first, let's address the kind of premise. Can a combat encounter be too long? I think that's easy. Everyone's been in a combat encounter that has felt like it's slogged on, right? Where, the players aren't hitting. Maybe the enemies are hitting a little too hard, but not enough to kill players, just enough for them to act super cautious. And I think that is actually something that is super common, right? The too long combat. And there's ways, we've talked about it before, ways to cut back, like, time of the players. Tell them before their turn, hey, you're on deck, get ready. There are ways that you can shorten it, but in terms of the whole concept, sometimes you can plan a combat that even with everybody just being on top of it, being on the ball, they still go too long. Maybe you put a lot of enemies. Maybe you just made a super beefy, character. Maybe the dice just isn't in your favor. Whatever it is, it can drag on and everybody can just be super relieved once it's done, which isn't a fun feeling as a DM, right? You don't want to feel like you're presenting your characters with something that's a bother because it's just a slog. But what about on the other hand, right? Like I think everybody, certainly me, I really like the idea of doing short combat encounters, right? Like, for example, it gets really easy to feel like, oh man, it's been a while since we've had combat. And then you plan a big combat. And then it feels like you're just like kind of drifting between too long combats and then too long of break from combat, doing role playing. Like you don't want that kind of yo-yoing back and forth between too much of one and too much of the other. And so like in the past, I've always thought like, oh, I should absolutely just do like short 2 or 3 round combats. And I've been able to pull it off a few times, and it is a fun palate cleanser in a campaign. But think about it. Like your time is valuable. Your player's time is valuable, right? And so just throwing a few weak enemies just to basically change it up just for the sake of changing it up, that can feel like a waste if you do it often enough, right? And if you do it without a specific purpose. So kind of with that framework in mind of the issues with being too long and too short, let's hop into the first question that can help you determine if your combat is the right length. And this question is, has each player had a chance to feel either useful, powerful, or seriously threatened? To repeat that, has each player had a chance to feel either useful, powerful, or seriously threatened? Now, each player needs to get something out of each combat, right? And I'm not just saying like, oh, they need to kill enemies. That's definitely not the only thing they can get out of that, right? Now, as I mentioned, one of those options that a player needs to feel is powerful. And oftentimes that is by just like, oh, they're hitting their roles or they built their character well and they just feel super powerful, right? They feel very min-maxed. And that's a feeling that makes combat enjoyable, right? When you're like, oh man, I actually did build a character that does well here and I can feel like I'm contributing every turn or almost every turn. But not every player and their character is built that well, or they're not having as much luck. And when that happens, it's like you can't just count on maybe the next combat maybe being where they feel powerful enough, right? In which case, you need to give them you know, a different something to take out of that combat. So if it's not, power in terms of they're just crushing the enemies, usefulness is another great one, right? If a combat encounter is built around an objective that is not solely killing the enemy, right? It's not just killing that pack of orcs. It's not just fighting the knight on the stairs, but it's getting past the knight and flipping a lever. Or it's okay, the orcs are surrounding a cage and there's like 3 kids in it, and you're worried that they might be taken hostage. You can telegraph these things to the players and give them these objectives that aren't solely like power related, to where they can be like, oh, suddenly the rogue who maybe, didn't build the most specialized for like dealing damage type of rogue, maybe they actually are like, oh, I have this separate objective where yeah, I can sneak past that knight while they're keeping him busy. I can flip that lever. I can get the people out of the crate. Or a priest, like, oh, I can go heal that person, that captain of the guard that is laying there dying, because they just got attacked. If you telegraph these different uses, these side objects, then that gives another chance for players who maybe aren't the most powerful to get something out of the combat, right? To feel useful. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, that's good. That means that in many ways, I can probably hit most of my players. I can make sure that some players get that, killing stroke, and that they end the enemy, and that's great. Or I can give them a side objective, but I can't get everybody. And that's where the third option comes in. Have your players had a chance to feel seriously threatened, because that's a type of thing that they can get out of the encounter, right? That feeling of walking, a tightrope, of, the worry that their character is going to go down and that they're going to fail that saving throw. These are things that, I think some DMs are really good at every combat making their players feel like this, because they just like plan really deadly combats. But if you aren't one of those DMs, and if you're the kind of person that's like, oh, I try and do balanced combats, then it's like, okay, maybe you want to make it occasionally unbalanced, or just unbalanced towards one player, where, yeah, maybe they've just, like, in the past few combats, they've either been useful or powerful, and you're trying to change it up for them. Then suddenly, okay, how can you do that? You make it so that, like, suddenly that trap that was in the room, instead of where you originally planned it, you actually put it right under where that person's going. And then suddenly they have to deal with the trap, right? And it's not the kind of trap that they deal well with. Or it is one, but like if they fail, you telegraph that, hey, you really need to hit this, because otherwise I'm going to be rolling a lot of damage. That threat is what can kind of add a spice to their experience in the encounter. So that's question number 1, right? It's honed in on making sure that each player has a good time with the combat, or a time that, feels like they're getting something out of it. So once you've looked at your combat, let's say you're in the middle of it and you're like, oh, has this combat gone on long enough? You can ask yourself, okay, has each of these 4 players felt either useful, powerful, or seriously threatened? And you can kind of adjust accordingly. Now, question number 2, has this combat encounter had at least one story-worthy moment? You might be thinking, Tanner, isn't that kind of what the first one was about? It's like, oh, if I'm feeling useful, powerful, or seriously threatened, isn't that like a story-worthy moment that I could tell my friends and be like, oh man, do you remember when we were in that combat and I almost died? See, like sometimes that's worth sharing, but it's not always, because feeling powerful is, hopefully something that a player feels often, right? And also, whatever the objective is, hopefully they hit those side objectives pretty often. And obviously they're going to feel seriously threatened pretty often. The point of question number 2 is not about, oh, are they getting these basic needs in a combat? It's about making every moment in D&D and every encounter serve a purpose, and have its own distinct spin. Um, so every moment in D&D needs to feel like it is, it's either immersing or like responding to character choices or plot development. But you as a DM, sometimes that's hard to incorporate into every combat. So, but you still want to make it so that the combat plays a role that the players kind of refer back to it as like, oh, this was something really interesting. I remember that combat. Um, and probably one of the best ways to do this is to plan it, like, plan a specific thing about the combat that it would be almost impossible for players to forget. For example, that could be, let's say that party of orcs. Some players just having like, oh, we saved those 3 kids would be enough, right? But that's not necessarily something that after the session's over, they say, oh man, do you remember that was so funny? Or, oh, that was so like intense. Just the fact that the kids are in the cage and that you need to go save them. Now, it'd be different if suddenly the kids are whiny brats that you're like, I don't know if I want to save them. Or if you really play up the opposite and they're like really pitiful. And they're like, please, sir, help me, And, that's something that like they could either laugh with or be like, oh, wow, I feel really immersed. You need that extra story element that makes the entire encounter worth remembering. Now, you could also make it so that the enemies you're fighting are exceptionally goofy or exceptionally vicious and evil, right? That's a great way to do it. Or you can make it so that the enemies actually are people that your party could come to an agreement with, right? Because players also remember times when they kind of flip the narrative, when they take what you had planned, which was, hey, duke it out. And they're like, actually, let's come to an agreement, because it feels like they created something out of nothing, right? They made their own path. And so the point of this second question, has this combat encounter had at least one story-worthy moment, is you looking at the combat as a whole and asking yourself, have I done something either in the setting or in the characterization or in the threat level or in how I describe the action that makes it so that the players will actually remember this combat as being different from the others or having an element that just sticks out to them. And this is going to look very different combat to combat and DM to DM, because each of you are better at something that sticks out to players, right? Some people are really good at voices and at being silly. And for those people, lean into that more, right? But then also occasionally flip it so that you can show a different side of your DMing style and be like, oh, you're used to a lot of normal combats where, oh, I've got, various levels of goofiness, various levels of NPCs acting kind of weird or insane. And suddenly you have a combat where the bandit that they're fighting just appears incredibly desperate. And you really play up that drama. You just want to make it different and memorable. Let's move on to question 3. Does the length of this combat match its importance? So I've talked about long combats and short combat encounters. With this question, it's bringing up the fact that a combat should only ever be as long as its importance within the story dictates, right? So for example, if you're doing it's okay to get away with a short, sharp, break up the role-playing type of encounter if you're keeping it short, right? Now, if you're just doing that type of more frivolous encounter, the one that's just, oh, the players made a stupid choice, but it doesn't affect the overall story. It's just like, oh yeah, they stole something and they got caught. And it's not like world ending or anything. Then you don't want to spend 15 plus rounds on that encounter, right? Because you're doing it to kind of like teach the players a lesson or to, create immersion, neither of which are super important to the overall story. They're interesting, and they're worth having a combat or an encounter over, but they're not, they're not hugely important, right? So for something like that, honestly, I would try and keep it to around 5 rounds long, like max. Now you could maybe do 6 or 7, but my point is, the longer you go, the more likely it is that, if the combat doesn't have real meaning, the players are going to subconsciously be just trying to get out of it. So, and in that case, they'd be like, oh, the players might realize it, and you're starting to realize it. This combat doesn't match, this length of combat doesn't match the importance of this encounter. Now, on the other hand, if you're doing like a mid boss, or it's the players finally are catching a clue that leads them to that next string or that next stretch on the campaign, that's a little more interesting, right? It's got kind of that medium weight of importance in the overall story. With something like that, doing an encounter that's closer, 5 to 10, that's totally in that ballpark, right? Where like, oh, you can feel that it has a story importance. And so you can go a little bit longer. You can make a little bit beefier mid-boss level enemies, right? Or enemies who, yeah, there's combat, and then there's some talking, and then some more combat, and then some more talking. And when I say 5 to 10, you can obviously go like 5 to 15, but 15 is at the far end, the long end of what a medium level encounter should be, right? And in terms of like 15 plus round encounters and combats, really save them for the most important moments, like the main boss of the campaign, or even just key story moments, like ones that you're like, I've been planning this, and this is huge, and this is a huge betrayal or moment in the campaign. Because think about it, 15 rounds. I'm saying, sometimes people even go longer than that, right? If you have 4 players, and 1 DM, and let's say, you're somewhat fast, but you're not like crazy fast. Let's say that that's like 3 minutes per person. Then with a full 15 round combat, that would take around 225 minutes, which is just shy of 4 hours. That's fine, but it's really going to be so exhausting, and you want the kind of combat that's super well planned, that has both combat and role playing, that has a lot of saving throws and a lot of really interesting abilities. You want all of that, because otherwise, if you're just doing a 15 round combat with just some lame, just some giant wolves or something, or like a couple of bears, then it's overkill. Yeah, maybe you just beefed up those bears because like, oh, the party's high level, I need to make it happen. I need to make it so that they are still having a hard time. Keep in mind, if the importance doesn't match the length of it, then the players won't have fun, or they'll stop having fun as soon as the kind of invisible importance meter has run up, right? Like for bears, that's, with a high level party, you can make really cool looking, sick, giant bears with just like runes all over them and flames coming out of their paws. But if the bears don't, if they haven't eaten any of the party members' family members, or if they haven't kidnapped a child who was really important to the party early on in the campaign or something, then you know what? Yeah, they should be, they should be rough, and they should hit the players hard. They should make them feel seriously threatened. But, around that 5, 6, 7 round mark, like that should absolutely be done. On the other hand, if you have a really important story moment and you just do like 5 rounds, then on the other hand, the players are going to be like, man, I was like thinking about this big baddie for a while, and I was thinking we've been working towards this for so long, and it ended in like 7 or 8 rounds. That felt kind of fast. You want the importance to match the length. I've said this a billion times. I'm going to say it a billion more times. Think logically about where that combat encounter fits in the arc of the story, and then set a hard limit. and plan the hit points, or on the fly change the hit points in the combat so that the combat gets over faster or lasts longer, and suddenly there's actually extra enemies getting thrown into it, right? So I hope that these 3 questions can help you understand some of the reasoning about why a combat exists and what makes it worth it. Because what these questions are really asking is like, hey, what are you trying to get out of a combat? Because once you've gotten that out of the combat, whether that's, the feeling of being useful, powerful, or seriously threatened, or a story-worthy moment, or, a certain length to match the story importance, once you've gotten that out of the combat, sticking around is only going to, waste time from progressing the story. It's going to feel like a slog to the players, and it's just unnecessary. So don't hold so tightly to your preconceived notions of what you wanted the combat to be if it doesn't fit with these important elements of what makes a combat, the right length. So next time you get out there and you're planning for your next session, because I will say these questions are best asked before, when you're preparing the session and the encounter. You can obviously on the fly add something, right? You can add a story-worthy element or make a certain player feel extra threatened or useful, but it's easier to do beforehand. So next time you are planning or in the moment, ask yourself these 3 questions. Has each player had a chance to feel either useful, powerful, or seriously injured? Question 2, has this combat encounter had at least one story-worthy moment? And question 3, does the length of this combat match its importance? And I guarantee you're going to feel a lot less of that slog and that lack of interest from your players. And you personally are going to feel like your combats aren't dragging, and also are hitting in the way that you wanted them to hit. And you're going to have a fun time. You're going to have those moments where at the end of the session, you guys are packing up and you guys are just talking about how fun the combat was, or how funny it was, or how like, oh man, I really thought I was gone there. You're going to have a lot of those moments because every combat's going to feel like that to some extent, right? So get out there, have a fun time, plan some amazing, properly lengthed combats. I don't know if that's the right way to use that word. But I really wish the best for you. And until next time, let's roll initiative.
Thanks again for listening to our show. If you like our content and would like to engage with more of it, head over to our Instagram account @HowToBeABetterDM and give us a follow. Make sure to watch some of our Dungeon Master rules videos while you're there to give yourself some more structure and procedure as a Dungeon Master. Also, don't forget to reach out with a DM and we can talk shop and I can get to know you a little bit better. Thanks again for listening.